who is infinitely responsible, precisely because we cannot get ourselves off the ethical hook by saying, oh, well, this is impossible. The critique of capitalism is impossible. This leads me to another aspect of Derrida, which is what he calls the weak messianic power, which turns on the performativity of the dead. For, unlike most Western philosophy, if you read Spectres of Mars, haunting of the dead is itself performative. And the ghosts are with us. They are making demands on us. They are demanding that we pay certain debts. And so that one of, I think, the least recognized aspects of Derrida's work is that the dead perform. And so it's not just language that has performativity, the dead have performativity, and therefore the haunting of the specter of Mars, for instance, is something that performs in all of political theory. And of course, the more you try to allow the specter, the more the specter comes back to demand that that debt be paid. This is why in Spectres of Mars, Derrida begins with the ghost that Hamlet has to confront. That ghost is making a set of demands. Ghosts have to be decoded. Ghosts are sending us messages that we have to understand, and debts that have to be paid. So not only do we have infinite responsibility, we also have to confront the actual performativity of the haunting of the other that is beyond us. And this is also the opening to the weak messianic power, which is that there's always the other coming to you that might explode any sense of subject self-certainty. This notion of haunting, I think, was completely misunderstood in its performativity by Habermas, who's kind of literal-minded and would like to just keep the dead in their graves and not making any demands on him. Finally, I just want to end with another aspect of performativity in continental philosophy more generally, which has to do with Kant's third critique and the notion of reflective judgment as itself performative. And particularly in a lot of the writings of black feminist philosophers, and also black artists, black writers, there's been the argument, and you see this also echoed in Garcia Spivak's work, on Rani Samur and her cousin, who committed suicide, another dead woman who had a message that she was sending that needed to be decoded, who was haunting Spivak, is that there's a performativity in the power of judgment itself. And in Kant, particularly in terms of the sublime, when we are called to a sensus communis aestheticist to make a judgment that an object is beautiful or sublime, there are no rules or principles behind us by which we do that, yet we are called to judge. Now, in a way, I think the best understanding of Kant is that at that moment of judgment, you actually call into being a different kind of community of human beings who are judging. And therefore, there's a kind of ideality to that performativity. And Hannah Arendt, to some degree, misses that by saying, well, this is something like a common sense that we already share. But particularly in post-colonial theory and Spivak, when we're called to mourn the Rani of Samur, to whom we cannot get any message heard or decoded, or when in Toni Morrison, we're called to mourn for a black woman slave through the reworking of a myth who had to kill her children, or we're called to mourn for Sarah Bartman, who was turned into an object because black women artists turned what was done to her body into a symbol of the tragedy of how black women have fallen below visibility and certainly below the bar of humanity. When we're called to make that judgment that this tragedy is sublime, in a certain sense at the moment of judgment, we're actually performing a different kind of human being, a different kind of humanity that is coming into being with the judgment. So judgment itself is a form of performativity. This is something that I often debated with Derrida. I think clearly in some of his later work on the death penalty, on his writing on animals, in his writing on women, in his writing on Islamic religion, in his writing on the events of 9/11, Derrida, with the call to infinite responsibility, also began to emphasize the performativity of judgment. In a certain sense, when he says in negotiations, we must get our hands dirty, that we are called to judge. And when we are called to judge, in Rancière's sense, we're also in a certain way developing a different distribution of the sensible, where what was rendered invisible or taken for granted, that black women were objects that were clearly beyond the bar of humanity, is fundamentally challenged. So I want to lay out all these different ways of thinking about performativity, because the continental tradition is extraordinarily rich in the subtleties, the intersections, and the difference in which performativity is defined. So that sums up what I have to say.
Just go on.
Straight on, yes.
Okay, good. These are only notes, we don't have a paper. Well, following up on what Drucilla just said, I would start by saying this. The way I understand the notion of iterability, as Derrida introduces it in signature event context, it means that ultimately, when we speak, and as we speak, we can never decide in advance how alteration and idealization will relate to each other in language, in the language we are using. So it is a relationship, as it were, between idealization and alteration, both of which are named by iterability. Language works in such a way that it would not exist without some idealization. It could not exist without some idealization, but at the same time, this idealization remains exposed in and through the very usage of language to alteration. So it is the undecidability as to how the two relate to each other that iterability names. I can't decide in advance how they relate to each other. And that's what happens when I use language. I am exposed to this kind of undecidability. Yes? That's how I would understand it. But that means then that you can really either stress the stabilizing effect of language and of the usage of language, or you can stress the destabilizing effect. And depending on what you stress, you will have a more, let's say, reformist version of deconstruction, or a more revolutionary version of deconstruction. And I think that Derrida throughout was very good at stressing one moment over the other depending on the context. So when you would expect him to be this incredible revolutionary as a philosopher, he suddenly stressed the stabilizing moment and everybody was a bit puzzled. And when people thought that, he was someone that you could talk to, good social democrat and so on, he stressed the other aspect, and again people were puzzled. And ultimately they were puzzled by him because he was, depending on the context, stressing one side or the other, but never the one that you were expecting him to stress. That also means that he could easily get away with everything or almost, and at the same time provoke a lot of polemical reactions to what he said. He was never as radical as you would expect, but he was always more radical than you thought he was, and you never knew how radical he was in the end. So that much about iterability, improvising a few thoughts in relation to what Drucilla said. Now, what I had prepared really has also to do with what you just said. That's a nice coincidence because it has to do with performativity and the dead. And I would like by starting to quote a sentence from a philosopher that will be mentioned tomorrow. I think he may have been mentioned today, and that's Stanley Cavell. Because Cavell, in an essay which you will find in his collection, Philosophy After the Day of Tomorrow, I think it's called, introduces an interesting distinction, I think. He thinks that one has to distinguish when discussing the speech acts. He thinks we have to distinguish from what Austin calls performative acts, what he wants to call Cavell, that is, passionate utterances. Passionate utterances. And this distinction between passionate utterances and the performative in Austin, for him, is, as it were, an attempt to go beyond performance, the performance of ritual. Yes? So as long as you talk about performatives in the sense in which Austin does, you remain on the level